If I asked you to point to the largest bank in the world, you'd probably look for, a massive skyscraper somewhere.
Right, something filled to the brim with gold vaults and rows of tellers.
Exactly. But today, the world's largest bank holds absolutely zero physical cash.
It's wild to think about.
It really is. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at a stack of sources you sent us that is, frankly, intimidating.
Yeah, it's a dense collection.
I mean, we've got timelines of the Industrial Revolution, corporate revenue spreadsheets, deep dives into behavioral economics, geopolitical maps, and even ancient philosophical frameworks.
It's a lot, but what's fascinating here is the underlying thread connecting all of it. For someone like you, the listener, who is trying to make sense of the modern world without getting bogged down in the daily noise, this deep dive is really about decoding the hidden, colliding forces that are rapidly reshaping our 21st century reality.
Yeah, we're going to bridge the gap between massive, abstract, global macro trends and how you can actually apply this to your own strategic thinking. So, okay, let's unpack this because the contrast between where we started and where we are now is just jarring. In your sources, there's a timeline of industrial revolutions, plural.
Right, not just one.
We always hear about, the Industrial Revolution, but the sheer velocity of how we moved from steam power to the reality we live in now is wild.
The acceleration is the key takeaway here. If we look at the first industrial revolution back in 1784, it was entirely about harnessing natural physical power,
Right.
Water and steam driving the mechanical loom.
Right.
And it took nearly a century to reach the second industrial revolution, which brought us mass production and electrical energy. And this is where the sources highlight a detail that, frankly, most people miss. When we think of the first assembly line, we almost automatically picture Henry Ford.
Yeah, the classic black and white footage of cars rolling down a factory line.
Well, according to the timeline and the research, the actual conceptual breakthrough happened in Cincinnati slaughterhouses around 1870.
Wait, really? A slaughterhouse?
Yeah.
How did that even work?
So it wasn't an assembly line, it was actually a disassembly line. Instead of a group of workers moving around a stationary product to do different tasks, they hung the carcasses on an overhead trolley system.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and the product moved past a line of stationary workers, and each one performed one specific, highly repetitive cut. It was a masterclass in the division of labor. Decades later, industrialists like Ford essentially reverse-engineered that logic.
So instead of taking something apart as it moved down the line, they put it together.
Exactly.
That is wild. So we go from slaughterhouses and electricity to the third industrial revolution, which your sources place around 1969 with the electronic and IT systems.
Yep, they specifically mention the first programmable logic controller, the Modicon Order 84.
And now we are currently blasting through the fourth and entering the fifth industrial revolution.
Cyber-physical systems.
Right, but the terminology here gets heavy. Artificial intelligence, 6G networks, digital twins, and cobots. Can we demystify that a bit?
Certainly. The shift to cyber-physical systems means the physical world and the digital world are no longer separate. Take digital twins, for example.
Okay.
It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a highly detailed, real-time, virtual simulation of a physical object. It could be a jet engine or an entire city grid. You use the digital twin to run tests and predict failures before you ever touch the real thing.
That makes sense. And what about cobots?
Right, so cobots are collaborative robots. Instead of a massive, dangerous machine locked inside a safety cage, welding car parts, a cobot is designed to safely share a workspace and physically interact with humans.
And the most obvious, everyday symbol of this massive fifth industrial revolution is sitting right in our pockets.
Absolutely.
Looking at your notes, I realized something. We still call it a smartphone, but it isn't actually a phone anymore. It's a pocket-sized black hole.
A black hole. That's a very apt way to look at it, actually. Physically speaking, how do you mean?
Think about the sheer physical mass it has swallowed. The sources listed out: blood pressure monitors, torches, heavy cameras, folding maps, radios, massive CRT televisions, sound systems, speedometers,
Clocks, remote controls.
typewriters, altitude meters, metal detectors, physical books. It's a literal black hole for physical mass. The plastic, the copper wires, the glass lenses of 50 different industries got pulled across the event horizon and digitized into code.
It really is staggering when you put it like
It
that.
has fundamentally altered our relationship with the physical world because all those standalone physical tools they vanished into a piece of glass.
And the digital infrastructure required to replace all that physical mass is massive. By the third quarter of 2022, there were over 3.5 million apps available on Google Play alone,
Wow.
and the Apple App Store had over 1.6 million. To access this invisible infrastructure, global smartphone sales peaked at over 1.5 billion units a year around 2018.
1.5 billion pocket universes sold in a single year. And this mass digitization brings up something that genuinely confused me in the research. I'm looking at this list of the most powerful corporate empires today.
Okay.
Uber is the world's largest taxi company, but they own no vehicles. Facebook is the most popular media owner, but they create no content. Alibaba is the most valuable retailer, but they hold no inventory.
Airbnb is the largest accommodation provider, and they own no real estate.
Right, and Bitcoin, like we mentioned at the start, operates as the world's biggest bank with no actual physical cash. I don't get it. How are these companies valued in the billions if there are no physical assets backing them up?
Because the definition of an asset has completely changed. In Industry 5.0, the physical cars or the real estate aren't the primary generators of wealth. The asset is the data.
So it all just comes down to data being power.
Well, data is raw potential. It only becomes power when it's actively weaponized to predict and influence behavior. These assetless giants sustain their empires through massive data analytics in a field called neuromarketing.
Neuromarketing. That sounds incredibly dystopian. How does that actually work?
So traditional marketing asks consumers what they want, right?
Yeah, like focus groups.
Exactly. Neuromarketing bypasses the rational brain entirely. It uses technologies like functional MRIs, eye tracking, and biometric data to monitor subconscious reactions.
You're kidding.
No, it measures pupil dilation or microhesitations to understand the deep neurological why behind our choices. They're essentially mapping human instincts to predict our decisions before we consciously make them.
So they aren't just looking at my search history, they're reverse engineering the psychological triggers that make me click in the first place.
Precisely. Cyber-physical systems use this data to optimize absolutely everything. Take the algorithm behind a tool like ChatGPT or advanced navigation systems.
Okay.
If you ask your device, the car wash is 40 meters from my home, should I walk or drive? It doesn't just give you a static map. It analyzes the context, the exact distance, the real-time weather, your physical mobility habits, and traffic patterns to prescribe the optimal human action.
But there have to be immense real-world consequences when corporations have this level of predictive capability.
Oh, absolutely. Your sources highlight a stark historical example of this, the Cambridge Analytica incident.
Right.
The data of 50 million Facebook users was captured without their explicit consent. That data was then fed into predictive algorithms to build psychological profiles, which were utilized to target and influence voters during the 2016 U.S. election.
Wow.
And, strictly speaking, from an analytical view, regardless of the politics involved, it is a definitive example of how an invisible asset like data can be leveraged to shape massive, tangible, real-world events.
But here's where I see a fatal flaw in this entire data harvesting business model. These assetless giants are spending billions to hack the attention of people in the developed world, but they are completely saturating their own market.
Yes, they are.
And according to your sources, in their total obsession with algorithms and neuromarketing, they are entirely blind to a massive, untapped physical market, literally half the planet's population.
Yes. If we zoom out and look at the global economic pyramid, the top is dominated by extreme wealth and hyperconnectivity. But at the very base, what the economist C.K. Prahalad termed the bottom of the pyramid, or the BOP, you have roughly 4 billion of the world's poorest citizens.
4 billion.
Yeah, these are individuals living on less than $2.50 a day.
That's literally half the globe.
And historically, traditional corporations have viewed this demographic purely as a space for charity, or they've just ignored them entirely. They're largely excluded from organized financial services, wide consumption choices, global trade.
Right.
But Prahalad argues that this exclusion is a massive failure of corporate vision.
Because if you actually aggregate the economic activity of 4 billion people, it's enormous, right? The sources mention a $5 trillion market. But wait, it says $5 trillion in purchasing power parity. What does that actually mean for the listener?
Right, so purchasing power parity, or PPP, is an economic metric that adjusts for the actual cost of living in a specific region. A U.S. dollar goes much further in a developing nation than it does in New York.
Ah, okay.
So when you measure the actual goods and services those 4 billion people consume locally, it equates to a massive $5 trillion economic engine. The bottom of the pyramid isn't just a charity case. It is the single largest untapped consumer market on Earth, waiting for inclusive, non-paternalistic capitalism.
I really want to understand what that looks like in practice. I mean, how do you integrate people making $2 a day into the global economy without exploiting them?
The explosion of the microfinance industry is cited in your sources as one of the undeniable successes here.
But how do you lend money to someone with zero physical collateral? If a traditional bank won't give them a loan because they don't own a house, how does microfinance work?
By relying on social collateral.
Social collateral.
Yeah, microfinance institutions often lend to small groups of women in a village. If one person defaults, the whole group loses access to future credit. So community trust, social pressure, and deeply ingrained relationships become the collateral instead of a physical asset.
Oh, wow.
It completely bypasses the traditional banking requirements and empowers local entrepreneurship.
To make the reality of the BOP even more grounded, your sources provided a fascinating case study on the socioeconomic structure of Pakistan. It paints a very vivid picture of what this pyramid actually looks like on the ground.
It does. In Pakistan, the elite class makes up less than 1% of the population. The rich and affluent are just 1 to 3%. But when you look at the bottom, the lower class, the poor, and the extremely poor, they make up over 50% of the population.
That is a staggering imbalance.
We're talking about roughly 130 million people in those lower tiers.
And the systemic hurdles keeping them trapped in that tier are immense. The data shows 13% of Pakistani children do not finish primary school education, and the country spends just 0.8% of its gross domestic product on health.
Which the United Nations notes is vastly insufficient. When you have minimal healthcare and massive educational dropouts, upward mobility stops. And this raises an important question. What happens to a society when a massive portion of its population is structurally excluded from economic progress?
It inevitably boils over into instability.
Exactly. Your sources include powerful images and accounts of labor protests, workers from the Nestle Camberwala factory and the carpet industry taking to the streets, demanding basic rights and fair wages.
Right.
This isn't just a localized issue. It is a direct, physical manifestation of the global tension at the bottom of the pyramid. When systemic exclusion meets a lack of basic resources, societal friction is unavoidable.
Which brings us to a really harsh reality check. We have hyper-advanced cyber-physical systems on one hand, and billions of new potential consumers at the bottom of the pyramid on the other. But whether you're a tech giant looking for new data or an entrepreneur trying to bring inclusive capitalism to the BOP, eventually you are going to slam into a physical wall.
Yes, you are.
Because the digital world might feel infinite, but the physical world is absolutely finite.
This is where we hit the hard limits of our fragile planet. And to understand this, we first have to recognize that the traditional lines of global power are blurring. If you look at a list of the top 100 entities in the world ranked by revenue, you don't just see countries anymore. Corporations are rivaling entire nations.
Yeah, looking at this chart, it's staggering. The United States and China are at the top, obviously. But then you scroll down, and Walmart is number 10.
Right.
Walmart generates more revenue than the entire GDP of Australia, South Korea, or Spain. Apple is number 25.
But regardless of their massive revenue, these corporate giants are still bound by physical geography.
I see.
The globe is fractured into regional alliances, the European Union, ASEAN in Southeast Asia, SAARC in South Asia,
Right.
and global trade is utterly dependent on very fragile maritime choke points. The movement of wheat, maize, soybeans, and oil is highly vulnerable to geographical bottlenecks. If a single canal is blocked, the entire global supply chain shudders.
Speaking of oil, this was the most sobering number in the entire stack of sources, and it really highlights the hard math of physics and resources.
Yes. The world currently has roughly 1.3 trillion barrels of proven oil reserves left. Based on our current global consumption of over 37 billion barrels a year,
Wait for it.
we have exactly 47 years of reserves remaining.
47 years. I want that to sink in for a second. That's not abstract. That is a hard deadline within our lifetimes. And those remaining reserves are heavily concentrated geographically, led by Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Iran.
It forces a hard mathematical limit on endless industrial expansion. And what's fascinating here is that it's not just the physical supply chains of oil and wheat that hit these limits. Even the most advanced, invisible digital economies eventually crash into the hard limits of physical reality.
Let's look at high-frequency trading. Oh, this blew my mind.
It's a great example.
So high-frequency trading is when financial institutions use supercomputers to execute millions of trades in fractions of a second based on algorithms.
Right. But no matter how fast your algorithm is, it is bound by the ultimate speed limit of the universe, the speed of light.
Because data is ultimately light traveling through fiber optic cables.
Precisely. It takes a signal traveling at the speed of light, roughly 67 milliseconds, to travel halfway around the Earth. To a human, 67 milliseconds is imperceptible. But to an algorithm executing thousands of trades a second, a 67 millisecond delay is an eternity.
Wow.
It is the difference between a massive profit and a catastrophic loss.
So we're essentially bumping up against the laws of physics.
Literally. Because of this speed of light limitation, the physical geographic placement of server farms matters immensely. The maps in your sources show that high-frequency trading hotspots aren't just put anywhere.
Right.
They are strategically built precisely midway between major financial centers, say exactly between Chicago and New York. Firms will spend hundreds of millions of dollars to bore a straight tunnel through a mountain just to lay a fiber optic cable that shaves 2 milliseconds off their transmission time.
It is absolutely absurd. We are spending billions just to move a server farm 50 miles closer to an exchange for a 2 millisecond advantage. It's like we've built a 21st century digital light-speed brain, but we're still forcing it to run on
A 20th century physical digestive system.
Exactly. Cargo ships, dwindling oil reserves, and finite physical space. The friction between those two realities is creating massive chaos.
Chaos is exactly the right word. Between the hard limits of finite resources, sudden global pandemic shocks like COVID-19, the global economic crisis, and the geopolitical strain of the war on terror, the era of traditional, predictable, long-term planning is dead. You cannot chart a safe, 5-year path in a world this volatile.
So what does this all mean for you listening? How do individuals and organizations actually survive, let alone thrive, when everything is this unpredictable?
To navigate this, your sources suggest we first have to understand the critical difference between data and wisdom. They provide a brilliant philosophical progression.
Let's hear it.
A collection of data is just raw facts. It is not information until you understand the relations between those facts. A collection of information is not knowledge until you understand the underlying patterns. And a collection of knowledge is not wisdom until you understand the core guiding principles.
We are drowning in oceans of data, but we are starving for wisdom.
Exactly. And the wisdom required to survive today requires a fundamental shift in how we think about strategy. We have to move away from what your sources call managerial or causal thinking and embrace entrepreneurial or effectual thinking. This is known as effectuation theory.
Okay, causal versus effectual thinking. I loved this part because it makes so much practical sense. So traditional causal thinking is like picking a highly specific recipe. Say, you decide you are going to make a beef Wellington.
Right.
You write down the exact list of ingredients, you drive to the store, and you acquire those specific means to achieve your predetermined goal.
Which works perfectly if the grocery store is fully stocked and the roads are clear. It assumes a predictable future.
Right. But effectuation, entrepreneurial thinking, is completely different. It's like opening your fridge, seeing what random ingredients you already happen to have. You know, some eggs, half an onion, maybe some hot sauce.
Right, just working with what's there.
Yeah, and using your imagination to figure out what kind of new, interesting meal you can cook with them right now.
That is a perfect analogy. Effectuation accepts that the future is fundamentally unknowable. So instead of predicting the future, you control what you can. You start with your given means, who you are, what you know, and who you know.
Right.
And from those existing ingredients, you imagine many possible new ends. It makes you highly adaptable to sudden shocks. If a pandemic hits or an oil crisis strikes, the causal planner's recipe is ruined. The effectual thinker just looks back in the fridge and cooks something else.
And to anchor this concept, your sources actually pull from ancient wisdom to deal with modern chaos. Sun Tzu.
Yes. Sun Tzu's The Art of War aligns perfectly with effectual thinking. Sun Tzu didn't advocate for rigid, unyielding battle plans. He emphasized deeply understanding your current strategic position and constantly collecting competitive information.
Basically opening the fridge to see what you actually have.
Exactly. And by doing so, you automatically select moves that minimize your losses. Sun Tzu teaches that a brilliant strategist instantly recognizes the specifics of a situation and responds adaptively, securing an advantage without overcommitting to a fragile plan. You let the terrain and the enemy dictate your fluid response.
So let's trace the massive journey we just took. We started by looking at the staggering velocity of human progress, how we shifted from steam power and slaughterhouse disassembly lines to a reality where our smartphones act as black holes, digitizing the physical mass of our world.
We examined the paradox of Industry 5.0, where assetless megacorporations extract billions in value not from physical goods, but by weaponizing neuromarketing and data to predict our subconscious behavior.
Yet we saw the massive blind spot of these algorithms, the 4 billion people at the bottom of the pyramid. We unpacked how tools like microfinance use social trust instead of physical collateral to unlock a $5 trillion opportunity for inclusive capitalism.
And we confronted the unavoidable, hard physical limits of our planet, the reality of only having 47 years of oil left, and the absolute absurdity of fighting the speed of light to shave milliseconds off financial trades.
Which all leads to the ultimate takeaway for navigating this chaos. Survival requires the wisdom of effectual thinking, taking the ingredients you actually have and constantly reinventing the menu.
As we wrap up, there is one final profound thought tucked away in your source's philosophical notes on wisdom. We talked about moving from data to wisdom, but the text adds one final challenging layer.
Oh.
It states, "A truth may not be the reality. A reality cannot be explored through reason unless it is revealed."
That gave me chills when I read it. In a 21st century world where algorithms, neuromarketing, and endless streams of data are constantly trying to construct and define what is true for us, well, what hidden realities are we completely failing to see simply because they haven't been revealed on our screens?
It demands that we look far beyond the data dashboard.
It really does. Thank you so much for bringing such an incredible, a complex stack of sources to the table for this deep dive. It's given us an entirely new way to look at the world. Because as we've seen today, that clean, predictable reality we all want doesn't exist anymore. The world is chaotic and the physical limits are closing in, but with the right wisdom, you can still learn how to navigate it. Catch you next time. If I asked you to point to the largest bank in the world, you'd probably look for, a massive skyscraper somewhere.
Right, something filled to the brim with gold vaults and rows of tellers.
Exactly. But today, the world's largest bank holds absolutely zero physical cash.
It's wild to think about.
It really is. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at a stack of sources you sent us that is, frankly, intimidating.
Yeah, it's a dense collection.
I mean, we've got timelines of the Industrial Revolution, corporate revenue spreadsheets, deep dives into behavioral economics, geopolitical maps, and even ancient philosophical frameworks.
It's a lot, but what's fascinating here is the underlying